If the UFC is one thing, it's consistent. Since the ESPN deal, the company has produced more than 40 fight cards each year. In monthly pay-per-views, we get to see the best of the best fight each other in every division in the UFC. But lately, the light heavyweight division has had some inconsistency. Luckily, a fight for the vacant title between Yuri Prochazka and Alex Pereira is taking place soon at UFC 295, which may clear the division up a bit. But is the best 205er in the UFC currently? Throughout the past few years, there have been some question marks in what is arguably the UFC's most iconic division. So today, we're going to do a deep dive of the turbulent recent history of the UFC light heavyweight division. The reason why the UFC 205-pound division was so iconic is because some of the sport's earliest stars in the Zuffa era were light heavyweights. Legends like Quinton Rampage Jackson, Rashad Evans, Lyoto Machida, and Mauricio Shogun Rua all held UFC gold at light heavyweight, and then Jon Jones beat them all, and convincingly. In 2011, at just 23 years old, Jon Jones dominated Shogun Rua in his maiden title fight, winning the title and becoming the youngest UFC champion ever, a record that still stands to this day. Then, he rattled off a win streak like no other, winning 8 straight fights in his title defenses against the legends that I mentioned before and a bunch of other great fighters. He defended his title against the legends I mentioned before like Rampage, Lyoto Machida, and Rashad Evans, but after those fights he also defended his title against Vitor Belfort, Chael Sonnen, Alexander Gustafsson, Glover Teixeira, and Daniel Cormier, all before being stripped of the title in March of 2015, a couple months after the Cormier fight due to the infamous hit-and-run incident. We'll provide a link to an article about it in the description in case you don't know about that, because it's time to move on to round 2. When Jon Jones was stripped of the title, he already had his next defense booked against knockout artist Anthony Rumble Johnson. Because of this, the UFC booked a fight for the vacant title between Rumble and previous title challenger Daniel Cormier. Cormier won this fight at UFC 187 via submission to become UFC light heavyweight champion, and then defended his title against Alexander Gustafsson in an all-time classic at UFC 192. This brings us to 2016. Jon Jones was suspended and inactive since January of 2015 while he dealt with his out-of-the-octagon problems, but in 2016, he was back and he wanted his shot at Cormier. Many fans agreed with Jon Jones when he argued that Cormier wouldn't be considered the true champion until he beat Jon Jones. The rivals were originally set to rematch at UFC 197 in April of 2016, but Cormier had to withdraw with an injury, forcing an interim title fight between Jon Jones and Ovince St. Preux, where Jones won a clear decision in a very forgettable main event. But hey, now Jon Jones was the UFC interim light heavyweight champion, and the stage was set for what was billed as the biggest UFC card of all time to that date, UFC 200. The card was to be headlined by the rematch between the champion Daniel Cormier and now the interim champion Jon Jones in Las Vegas on July 9th, 2016. Or was it? Jon Jones tested positive for multiple banned substances just 4 days before the massive card, which also featured 2 other title fights, as well as the surprise return of Brock Lesnar. The positive test forced the UFC to strip Jones of his interim title. It also forced the UFC to remove Jon Jones from UFC 200 entirely, much to Daniel Cormier's dismay. As the old saying goes, the show must go on, and UFC 200 did continue without Jon Jones on the card. Daniel Cormier beat Anderson Silva by unanimous decision in an underwhelming non-title fight on an underwhelming UFC 200 card. But hey, Brock Lesnar did get a win in his return, and no he didn't. No he didn't. It's a real shame about those PEDs, huh? Also, a yellow canvas? Yellow? Alright. I'm done making fun of UFC 200, so let's move on. With Jones out again, Cormier continued to cement his own legacy at 205 pounds with another defense over Rumble Johnson at UFC 210 during Jones' suspension. Now we move to July 29th, 2017, where it was finally time for one of the biggest rematches in MMA history at UFC 214. The reigning UFC light heavyweight champion Daniel Cormier versus the disgraced former champion fresh off of his suspension, Jon Jones. The rematch was even more entertaining than the first fight, with Daniel Cormier landing lots of punches in the pocket against Jones early. Jones, who is most known for managing his range well with his massive 84.5-inch reach, had little to no answer for Cormier's clinch uppercuts and close-range boxing. That was until Jones started kicking DC to the body. What seemed like a move meant to tire DC out was really a setup for what would mark the end of this bout. After landing some heavy body kicks in rounds 2 and 3, Jones finally began to see what he was waiting for. Cormier started to drop his hands to stop the body kicks from landing, which opened him up for a massive head kick, which Jones landed midway through the 3rd round. From there, Jones intelligently chased DC down and tripped him as he hurried backwards. Once the champion fell, Jones unleashed a vicious barrage of ground and pound until the fight was stopped, and Jones was undisputed champion again. For now. Daniel Cormier was once again the beneficiary of a Jon Jones mistake about a month after UFC 214 when Jones tested positive for turinabol, an anabolic steroid. Jones was subsequently stripped of his title again, and it was returned to the previous champion in Cormier. Cormier was bewildered by Jones's troubles with USADA drug testing, saying, "In my mind, on July 29th, I competed and I lost. I thought Jon Jones was the better man that day. I don't know what to think anymore. I can't believe we're going through all of this again. We will see what happens next." Cormier would find out what was next in no time, as his next defense was in January of 2018 at UFC 220 against surging contender and flash knockout artist Volkan "No Time" Ozdemir. Cormier dismantled Volkan early and finished him in the 2nd round to defend the light heavyweight crown. After this, in the main event, UFC heavyweight champion Stipe Miocic pulled off an unexpected gritty win against hyped-up contender Francis Ngannou, a truly generational knockout artist. Cormier had his sights set on heavyweight gold, saying it would be the most amazing thing in the world. The UFC granted Cormier's wish for an opportunity at double champ status on July 7, 2018 at UFC 226. It would be heavyweight champion Stipe Miocic versus light heavyweight champion Daniel Cormier for legacy. Stipe had a massive amount of hype on him going into this fight, as he was the man to finally get through the terrifying Ngannou's lights-out power, and Cormier, now turning into a well-regarded champion, was looking to prove himself once and for all, and finally, without the need for Jon Jones at all. Cormier pulled off a stunning upset, knocking Stipe Miocic out cold in the 1st round with a brutal elbow. Daniel Cormier was now double champ, and he called out Brock Lesnar, and then that fight happened, and just kidding. DC did have that awesome in-cage moment with Brock Lesnar, but that fight never materialized for whatever reason. But anyway, this was only the 2nd time a double champ had been crowned in UFC history, the first being when Conor McGregor won the UFC lightweight title at UFC 205, while also being the UFC featherweight champion. McGregor never defended his belts though. He had other intentions. But defending is something Cormier wanted to do, and he did. Cormier defended his new heavyweight title at UFC 230, demolishing Derek Lewis and finishing him by rear naked choke. Before the end of 2018, Cormier vacated the UFC light heavyweight title, leaving the championship in limbo, which wasn't an uncommon theme from 2015 on. But you may be wondering, where was Jon Jones? Like I said, Daniel Cormier vacated the title, but did he really feel that way? Not really, and maybe rightfully so. Jon Jones was finally able to return, and the UFC hoped Jones and Cormier could settle their beef once and for all in the octagon at 205 pounds. Cormier had no interest though. Plus, he was eyeing the Lesnar super fight and more of a career at heavyweight. This was bad because the UFC really wanted Jones to fight for the title, especially against Cormier, but DC never wavered and vacated the title one day before UFC 232, which was now a vacant title fight between Jon Jones and his old rival Alexander Gustafsson. Jones was unfazed by Cormier's decision, saying, "He never beat me. He actually lost to me twice. So relinquishing the belt, it's just like, it was never really his belt." Cormier felt as if he was forced to vacate the title or else he would have just been stripped. Dana White has refuted that claim, and both parties seem to be on great terms now, so there's no real point in examining this one further. A couple of days before the start of 2019, UFC 232 took place in California, which was interesting in its own right, as I'll get to. And let's just say Jon Jones had no trouble against Gustafsson, who was very close to dethroning Jones all the way back at UFC 165. Jones convincingly defeated Gustafsson, this time by a brutal third-round TKO, which meant Jon Jones was once again UFC light heavyweight champion, albeit a bit controversially. But who cares about a few picograms, am I right? In short, Jon Jones once again failed the drug test, but this time it wasn't as black and white. The data from his test shows that he had picograms of steroid metabolites in his system. What does this mean? Trace amounts in plain English, are nowhere near enough to enhance performance, and are barely detectable. Whether you think Jon Jones was clean or not for UFC 232 is up to you, but that's what was said, so that's the answer that we will use for our purposes. Due to this test though, Jones wasn't licensed to fight in Las Vegas where the fight was initially scheduled to be held, so that's why the UFC moved the entire event to California mere days before the card was to take place. No disciplinary action was ever taken, so Jones stayed champion. Now that Jones was champion, we saw some stability at light heavyweight for a while. Jon Jones defended his title multiple times against a new crop of rising contenders. He defeated Anthony Smith at UFC 235, Thiago Santos at UFC 239, and Dominic Reyes at UFC 247. That last win against Reyes was an interesting one. At this stage, all seemed to be forgiven for Jon Jones. It was February of 2020, and we seemed to be a long way from his initial legal troubles. We were also more than a year removed from the picogram situation at UFC 232. Jones was back in GOAT conversations and had many options. The UFC light heavyweight division had some life, with contenders like Jan Blachowicz and Corey Anderson hoping to be next in line for a title shot. Jones had teased going up to heavyweight after the Reyes fight, or even taking on the UFC middleweight champion at that time, Israel Adesanya, in a super fight likely at 205. But the Dominic Reyes win was not as easy as everyone forecasted. Reyes didn't respect Jones's range and landed many big punches and tons of leg kicks on Jones in the first 2 to 3 rounds. Reyes looked faster than the legendary champion. Jones couldn't use his wrestling either as Reyes was stopping the takedowns, but Jones got better as the fight went on. The way Jones reads fighters during the fight is incredible. His defense heavily improved round by round and he started to land more. The championship rounds were all Jon Jones. The fight was extremely close, with many believing Reyes did enough to beat Jones, but the judges didn't think so. 2 48-47s and one bizarre 49-46, all in favor of Jones. What did this mean for Dominic Reyes? Who would Jon Jones want next? Would Jon Jones give a shot to the rightful challenger? Or will he take a super fight against Israel Adesanya, who would go on to defeat Yoel Romero a month later at UFC 248? Or maybe a move up to heavyweight? After a lengthy dispute with the UFC over pay, Jon Jones decided to vacate the UFC light heavyweight title, not wanting to hold up the division any longer. Jon Jones wanted a few million extra for the risk of moving up to heavyweight to fight Francis Ngannou, who was once again on the cusp of a title shot himself. And that would be the last we ever saw of Jon Jones at 205 pounds. It's the last we'd see of him until his heavyweight return in March of 2023, where he'd win the UFC heavyweight title. But unlike Jones, this video is staying at 205 pounds. Let's see what happened next in 2020. With the UFC light heavyweight title vacant, they needed to put together a new title fight. The one they picked made perfect sense. The UFC put in Dominic Reyes, fresh off the Jones fight and with a chip on his shoulder, feeling like he was the uncrowned champion after UFC 247. His opponent? Surging contender Jan Blachowicz, who was coming off a first-round knockout of Corey Anderson in the title eliminator main event, which took place a week after UFC 247. The fight would take place in Abu Dhabi on September 26, 2020 in the co-main slot for Adesanya vs. Costa. The stage was set for UFC 253. Dominic Reyes came in feeling like he was already the champion, just unofficially. All he had to do was get through Jan Blachowicz. Blachowicz landed early on Reyes, dropping him in the first round. It didn't take much longer after that. Late in the very next round, Blachowicz hit Reyes with a jab, right straight, left hook combo to put him down. Dominic Reyes could only look up in awe as the new champion, Jan Blachowicz, began his reign. The title had slipped from Dominic Reyes' grasp again, but with a new champion. It was time to move on. Plus, there was still the main event. 2 undefeated middleweights still needed to scrap for their title. The champion, Israel Adesanya, against #1 contender, Paulo Costa. In the first round, Adesanya used feints to set up his elite counter-striking to basically freeze Costa in the octagon. Costa kept the pressure on Adesanya, but he wasn't able to land anything of note. As the fight continued in the second round, Costa began taking more chances, which led to big swings and misses. The leg kicks for Adesanya were adding up and starting to take a brutal toll on Costa. But then, after a massive roundhouse kick to Costa's head, Adesanya got what he was waiting for. Costa swung big to try and counter Adesanya's barrage, but missed. One mistake is all Adesanya needed, and he hit Costa with a great counter left hook and finished the fight on the ground. Adesanya also disrespected Costa after the stoppage. Man, I hope nobody's kids were watching that. After this huge win for Adesanya, a move to 205 pounds seemed inevitable. A super fight was in the making. With the future surrounding Jon Jones and the UFC getting more and more unclear by the day, Israel Adesanya was done waiting for a shot at a second title. Shortly after UFC 253, Dana White announced plans to have Israel Adesanya move up to 205 pounds to take on new UFC light heavyweight champion Jan Blachowicz. Talk about a test for Jan's first title defense, which would take place at UFC 259 in March of 2021. One of the biggest title fights in UFC history had to take place at the UFC Apex due to the pandemic. It didn't matter to the fans though. Israel Adesanya was on a trajectory to the moon. Only Jan Blachowicz stood in his way. The only problem is that this fight didn't always remain standing. Jan Blachowicz employed a brilliant strategy, using all facets of mixed martial arts to upset the rising superstar in Adesanya. Blachowicz won a chess match of a main event by unanimous decision to take away Adesanya's O. There were many factors that led to the outcome. For example, Israel Adesanya weighed in at 200.5 pounds, a decent margin under the light heavyweight limit. He was undersized, which may have led to some of the control time by Jan Blachowicz. However, this isn't to take away from the win. Even on the feet, Blachowicz outlanded Adesanya in every round. He kept Adesanya on the end of his jab and was smart with his combinations. The problem for a counter-striker like Adesanya was that Blachowicz wasn't putting himself in harm's way long enough. Jan Blachowicz was still UFC light heavyweight champion, and he now had the respect that he deserved. Israel Adesanya's light heavyweight title shot was fun for the fans, but not for seasoned UFC light heavyweight contenders. During this era, a lot was going on in the light heavyweight rankings. After all, Jon Jones wasn't looming over the division anymore. Previous challengers were attempting to earn their way back to a title shot with Blachowicz as champion. His presence instead of Jones's opened the door for the previously defeated contenders. One of those contenders was Glover Teixeira. Glover quietly put together a 4-fight win streak with 3 finishes in those fights. The last of those victories was against Anthony Smith. In a fight where Smith's boxing looked crisp early, Teixeira made it through Smith's early onslaught to put together a comeback for the ages. Smith ran out of gas, so in the final 3 rounds, Teixeira had nearly 8 minutes of control time where he was landing an enormous amount of punches on Smith, who literally told referee Jason Herzog that his teeth were falling out in round 4. The beating that the exhausted Smith took on the ground was beyond brutal and even controversial. The stoppage finally came early in round 5, which was much too late, but it capped off one of the best comebacks of the year. Most importantly, it propelled Glover Teixeira into the title conversation. After this fight, a title eliminator was booked between Glover Teixeira and Thiago Santos, who was making his return after his loss to Jon Jones in 2019. It was booked for a date in September, but was cancelled when Teixeira caught COVID. Then the UFC attempted to reschedule for October, but Santos caught COVID this time, causing the fights to get cancelled again. The fight would finally go down on November 7th, 2020 at the UFC Apex. Similar to the Smith fight, Teixeira was getting beat up early. Santos dropped Teixeira in the first round, but started to run out of gas after he couldn't get a finish. Glover Teixeira had this zombie-like presence in the cage. He'd get hurt early in fights, but always continued to walk down his opponents no matter what. Glover used this pressure to set up takedowns in the Santos fight. Glover Teixeira's signature ground and pound caused Santos to make mistakes. These mistakes and scrambles ultimately led to a rear naked choke finish by Teixeira in round 3. Teixeira was the number 1 contender, but his title shot would have to wait until after Blachowicz versus Adesanya. Well, Glover waited, and his title shot did come. Glover Teixeira was given his matchup with Jan Blachowicz at UFC 267 on October 30th, 2021 in Abu Dhabi. Glover Teixeira was now on a 5-fight win streak with 4 finishes coming into this fight with Blachowicz. In the last 2 wins though, Teixeira took a lot of damage. Glover was also now 42 years old. Surely he couldn't pull this off, right? Jan Blachowicz was coming off the win over Israel Adesanya, who looked unbeatable coming into that fight. The odds were not in Glover's favor, but did that matter? Nope. Glover Teixeira decided not to take any damage this time and immediately took Blachowicz down, controlling him for nearly the whole first round. The onslaught didn't last too long, with Glover hurting Blachowicz badly with a left hook during the second round. Teixeira took Blachowicz down again, and this would be all he needed. Teixeira submitted the champion with a rear naked choke very soon after that takedown. Glover Teixeira was now the UFC light heavyweight champion. He is still the oldest fighter to ever win a UFC title for the first time, being 42 years old, like I mentioned before. This was incredible for Teixeira, having fought through immigration issues, a brutal loss to Jon Jones in his only previous title opportunity, and more tough losses on his way back to his second chance at UFC Gold. The feat was even more incredible considering Teixeira's old age for MMA. With Teixeira being older, the UFC knew he probably wouldn't hold on to the title for long no matter what happened in his next fight. Teixeira was adamant that he planned on retiring after a single title defense. Who would that defense be against? When would it be? Those questions were answered when a new contender was placed into the mix at light heavyweight. Yuri Prochazka was the former Rizin light heavyweight champion with wins over proven talents like Vadim Nemkov, King Mo Lawal, and CB Dalloway. Yuri had an outstanding record of 26-3-1 coming into the UFC. He was on a 10-fight win streak coming into his UFC tenure. The bottom line is Yuri had a lot of hype surrounding him before he even got to the UFC. This led to his quick ascent. Yuri's UFC debut took place at UFC 251 in July of 2020. Yuri proved himself right away against former title challenger and top 10 UFC light heavyweight Volkan Ozdemir, knocking him out in the second round. Yuri was officially on the map, and in May of 2021, he made his case for why he should be given a title shot. Facing another former title challenger and number 3 ranked Dominic Reyes, Yuri dropped Reyes early, but Reyes wasn't just going away. Round 2 turned into a slugfest with both fighters hurting each other at different points. The only issue was the diversity of attacks. Reyes was attacking using mostly punches, but Yuri showed how unpredictable he could be. He landed front kicks, flying knees, and spinning strikes alongside the traditional kickboxing. Reyes was staying in the fight, countering when he could, but Yuri was walking him down, landing different combinations in every sequence. Just when it was getting hairy for Reyes, he landed a massive counter left and nearly submitted Yuri with a guillotine. Yuri Prochazka is no ordinary fighter though. He escaped the guillotine, and even after being hurt again by an upkick, he scrambled back to an advantageous position. The fight then headed back to the feet, and Yuri didn't need long with the wounded Reyes. He landed the most ferocious spinning back elbow we've ever seen in the UFC, and knocked Reyes out cold. Statement made, title shot earned. The UFC originally booked Glover Teixeira versus Yuri Prochazka for UFC 274 on May 7, 2022, but the light heavyweight title fight was moved to UFC 275, which would take place about a month later on June 11th in Singapore. What would take place that night will replay in true MMA fans' memories forever. In the first round, the chaos began. Glover took Yuri down multiple times and kept some control, but not for the usual entirety of the round. On the feet, it was a slugfest with Yuri looking much faster and more creative, but Glover landed his shots too as he pushed forward through the fire. While Glover controlled and took Yuri's back in the first, the round ended with Yuri landing heavy ground and pound on Glover after Glover slipped off Yuri's back. In the second, Yuri looked more like his usual self. He used his awkward movement to land many different strikes on Glover Teixeira and hurt him multiple times. Yuri was quicker and he was attacking Glover with everything in his arsenal. Glover stayed tough as nails though, battling back as he hit Yuri off balance with a left hook, and then jumped on top of him. This round ended in the opposite way of the first, with Glover landing vicious ground and pound on Yuri as the horn blared, signaling the end of the second round. Glover started the third round relentlessly trying to take Yuri down. Yuri had none of that though, landing power jabs and flying knees as he continued to switch stances to throw Teixeira off. Yuri hurt Glover with some boxing combinations, but as he let his strikes go, Glover took him down again. Yuri did well this time though, reversing Glover. After some scrambles, Yuri got free and picked Glover apart up against the cage, landing brutal shots to his head and body before taking Glover down. As Yuri worked for a choke on Glover, he got reversed. Glover ended the round in control, but just in Yuri's guard. In a fight full of back and forth rounds, it seemed like Yuri was gaining some momentum. As the fourth round began, Yuri picked the wounded Teixeira apart from the outside. Yuri was beginning to look fatigued though. After all, Glover was not an easy guy to put away despite all the combinations he was hit with. Just as the end seemed near, Teixeira went for and finished a double leg takedown after stunning Yuri on a counter. Glover mounted Yuri and attacked submissions in between the ground and pound he was landing. Yuri's submission defense and toughness were both on display in this round. Yuri reversed the position and landed some ground and pound, but Glover reversed the position again. Glover and Yuri swapped positions multiple times before round's end, just showing how even the two were. The horn blared as the ongoing classic would enter the 5th and final round. Glover walked Yuri down to begin the 5th and immediately hurt Yuri with a massive right hand. Yuri was hanging on for dear life, but Glover jumped guillotine instead of going for the finish on the feet. This was the biggest mistake he could have made, as Yuri ended up on top. Yuri recovered and the fight returned to the feet. Glover continued to pressure the exhausted Prochazka, hurting him again. Yuri proved his chin was just as great as Glover's though. Glover took Yuri down again and started to land some massive ground and pound once again as the clock was winding down. Yuri pushed his feet off the cage to reverse the position. He started to land some shots of his own on Glover and then stunned Glover by cinching a rear naked choke. Glover tapped and Yuri Prochazka became the new UFC light heavyweight champion after one of the greatest fights in the company's history. A rematch of the instant classic seemed inevitable. The big fight was booked for UFC 282 in December, but disaster struck. Yuri Prochazka suffered a horrendous shoulder injury in training. Instead of holding on to the title, Yuri elected to vacate, not wanting to hold the division back. Yuri also knew he would earn a title shot upon his return. This left the UFC light heavyweight title vacant once again. The UFC needed a new fight for Glover Teixeira. Rising star Magomed Ankalaev was subbed in, but Glover pulled out. He wanted more time to prepare for a completely different opponent. Ankalaev was no slouch after all and was on a 9-fight win streak, so people understood the decision by Teixeira. Former champion Jan Blachowicz took Glover's place, and a new fight was slated for UFC 282. It was Magomed Ankalaev versus Jan Blachowicz for the vacant UFC light heavyweight title. The fight would take place on December 10th, 2022 at T-Mobile Arena. Who would walk out as champion? Ankalaev for the first time, or Jan once again? The answer was neither. Blachowicz and Ankalaev fought such a close fight that it ended in a draw. This was one of the worst possible outcomes for the UFC. Both fighters believed they won, and there was still no UFC light heavyweight champion. The UFC reacted quickly. Glover Teixeira received a much-deserved title shot. Even coming off a loss, the decision made sense as it came in that instant classic at UFC 275 to Yuri. His opponent would be rising knockout artist Jamal Sweet Dreams Hill. He was on a 3-fight win streak with 2 first-round knockouts. He was coming off of a 4th-round TKO over former title challenger Thiago Santos. Once again, the stage was set for another fight for the vacant UFC light heavyweight title. The fight was slated for the very next pay-per-view to kick off 2023. UFC 283 took place on January 21st, 2023, in Teixeira's home country of Brazil. Would Teixeira be able to secure a second title reign in front of his home crowd, or would Jamal Hill play spoiler? It turned out that Jamal Hill didn't mind playing the villain. Hill showed his athleticism from pillar to post. He was so much faster than Glover Teixeira. Hill stopped 7 takedowns in the first round alone. He hurt Glover multiple times and just pieced him up throughout the 5 rounds. Glover Teixeira is always tough as nails though. He got his big shots in there despite ending up on the wrong side of a very one-sided decision. Jamal Hill won the fight by unanimous decision. All of the judges scored the fight 50-44 in favor of Hill. The scorecards don't show it, but this fight was a war. Hill won every round, but Glover landed his power punches and got some dominant control time. It just wasn't enough. Hill was one step ahead through most of the fight, and now Jamal Hill was UFC light heavyweight champion. You're probably thinking, tell me that Jamal Hill is still champion. If you're a hardcore fan, you already know what's coming. If you're a newer fan, let me fill you in. Jamal Hill ruptured his Achilles playing basketball and decided to vacate the UFC light heavyweight title. The division took another hit because the title was vacant again. The title has been vacant many times since the Jones DC days, but when you see how many times the title has changed hands since 2020, it really gives you a good perspective at just how legendary Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier were at 205 pounds. That's not to say every champion that followed wasn't awesome as well. Those guys had to face some tough competition. From Jon Jones to Jamal Hill, there have been some fantastic champions. It's now November of 2023, and like I said in the beginning, we have another fight for the vacant UFC light heavyweight title. Former champion Yuri Prochazka's shoulder is healed, and he's ready to go. The UFC put Yuri against former middleweight champion Alex Pereira. 2 champions will fight for a second chance at gold at UFC 295. We'll all be on the edge of our seats when it happens. It's It's fascinating to look back on all that's happened in the UFC's most iconic division in the past decade. I mean, there's been so many big stories, great fights, and just so much has happened, honestly, over the years, and it's crazy to look back at it. And this weekend, hopefully, Yuri and Alex Pereira both treat us to a fantastic fight for the UFC 295 main event. And if you haven't noticed, this is the third different outfit I've worn in this video. It took me a while to make and took a lot of research, whole lot of hard work. So that said, really appreciate it if you guys would leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and enjoy the fights this weekend.